Ever since the Library of America was created in 1979, the press and the public have compared it to the Pléiade. In fact, the first article that ever appeared about the Library of America in the New York Times by Malcolm Cowley in 1979 had as its title, The American Pléiade. In developing the design and the format for the Library of America, we studied the Pléiade. In fact, we pored over it, not with the intention of copying it, but trying to find a way to express for our American series our national character in a way that the French have done so successfully with the Pléiade. In the simplest terms then, why do people think they are similar? Well, first of all, they are both a uniform series of books with a standard size and typeface. They're attractively printed and bound, which leads people to collect them. They both represent works that have, so to speak, stood the test of time. The volumes are not single titles. They are omnibus volumes. That is, they gather a number of works, or in some case, the entire corpus of a writer's work in a single volume, or maybe 2 or 3 or more, each of which has between 800 and 1,500 pages. Both have textual authority. That is, they both try to print the text that is closest to what the author intended. And publication in the Pléiade is considered a sign of major recognition for a writer. And neither series includes very many living writers. In the Pléiade's case, there are 16 writers who were published during their lifetime over a course of 83 years. So since 1931, 16 writers have had a volume in the Pléiade while they've been living. For the Library of America, 5 writers over the course of 32 years. So the rate is about the same. And finally, they are each considered the national edition of their country's literature, a kind of pantheon. But having mentioned some of these similarities, from this point, there are as many differences as you can imagine, and we hope to illuminate some of those differences today. First of all, just to mention a couple obvious ones, the Library of America publishes only American writers, whereas the Pléiade publishes distinguished writers from many different countries. Library of America volumes cost $35 to $40, while the Pléiade volumes cost $85 to $95. And from the point of view of the preparation of the editions, the Pléiade assembles teams of scholars who work for many years to establish a critical edition with abundant editorial material, manuscript variances, glosses, commentaries, and so on, where the Library of America publishes the best existing text with a moderate amount of annotation. But this is just the tip of the iceberg. There are many, many other differences that we will get into a little bit later. There could hardly be a more appropriate writer to discuss the cross currents of French and American literature than Paul Auster. Born an American, he is deeply involved with French culture, deeply rooted in French culture, I should say. He has lived in France, he has translated French works, he has edited an outstanding anthology of French poetry, and he is profoundly well-read in French literature. His books are cult classics in France, and when a new one comes out, it is a literary occasion, a landmark. The French consider him a French writer, or as near as someone born in America who writes in English can be. His friend Salman Rushdie said that he brings a European sensibility to an entirely American subject matter. And yet, for all of his Europeanness, and he has just returned from Krakow and Prague and points east, for all of his Europeanness, Paul Auster says that 2 of the writers who are closest to him are Poe and Hawthorne because of their authentically American voices. Paul Auster has written several dozen books, including his bestsellers Winter Journal, Sunset Park, Invisible, and the Book of Illusions. The New York trilogy had extraordinary success when first published in 1987. He has won many literary prizes and awards for his books and screenplays, including the Prince of Asturias Prize for Literature, the Medici Prize, the Independent Spirit Award, and his books are translated into 43 languages, an astonishing number for any writer. As yet another indication of his French-Americanness, he is both a member of the American Academy of Arts and Letters and a commandeur de l'Ordre des Arts et des Lettres. Messieurs et Mesdames, please welcome Paul Auster.
I really didn't recognize myself, but maybe that's me, I don't know. But, all right, so here we are, the Pléiade in the Library of America, which is to say, the literature of France and the literature of the United States. And because we're here to celebrate them both today, it's only natural to think about the connections between French and American literature, which are deep connections that go back more than a century and a half. And no sooner do I think about these connections than the name Edgar Allan Poe springs to mind, the first American poet to have made an impact in France, which leads to further thoughts about the curious way in which poetic works in one language can influence and be absorbed by works in another language. Scene 1. The unveiling of Poe's tomb in Baltimore in 1875. Poe had died in 1849, of course, 26 years earlier. And as everyone knows, the circumstances of that death were rather shocking and mysterious. The sad final year of his life, which included the death of his wife, the completion of his masterpiece, Eureka, and then the frantic, pathetic search for a new wife. Numerous proposals to women up and down the East Coast, all of which were rebuffed. And then a trip to his hometown of Richmond to deliver a lecture, which was well received and which inspired him to begin thinking about settling there. And finally, the strange and unaccountable binge in Baltimore, where he died in the gutter at the age of 40. All those facts are known. But less well known is what happened afterward. The grave in which Poe was buried remained unmarked for several years. Eventually, one of Poe's cousins, Nielsen Poe, came up with the money to order a headstone. But then, in one of those gruesome twists that might have been invented by Poe himself, the nearly finished stone was smashed to pieces when a derailed train fell into the marble yard where the work was being done. Nielsen couldn't afford to pay for another stone, and so poor Poe languished in his anonymous hole for another 2 decades. Midway through that purgatory, efforts were begun by a group of Baltimore schoolteachers to raise money for a second memorial stone. And after 10 long years, the stone was finally built. To mark the occasion, following Poe's exhumation and reburial of his remains in another plot, a ceremony was held at Baltimore's Western Female High School. What a wonderful name for a school. All the leading American poets of the day were invited, but one by one, they all declined. Longfellow, Holmes, Whittier, and others whose names have now passed into oblivion. In the end, only one poet deigned to grace the Western Female High School with his presence. The greatest of American poets, as it turned out, a man whose reputation was no less dangerous than Poe's, Walt Whitman. 5 years later, in 1880, Whitman wrote a short piece on Poe for a book that would eventually be published as Specimen Days. The chapter entitled Edgar Poe's Significance includes an excerpt from an article published in the Washington Star about Whitman's attendance at the Poe ceremony in 1875. So this is a quote from the newspaper article. It's hilariously written, that's why I wanted to read it. Being in Washington on a visit at the time, the old gray went over to Baltimore, and though ill from paralysis, consented to hobble up and silently take a seat on the platform, but refused to make any speech, saying, "I have felt a strong impulse to come over and be here today myself in memory of Poe, but I have obeyed, but not the slightest impulse to make a speech, which I have obeyed, but not the slightest impulse to make a speech, which, my dear friends, must be obeyed." In an informal circle, however, in conversation after the ceremonies, Whitman said, "For a long while, and until lately, I had a distaste for Poe's writings. I wanted, and still want for poetry, the clear sun shining and the fresh air blowing, the strength and power of health, not of delirium, even amid the stormiest passions, with always the background of the eternal moralities. Non-complying with these requirements, Poe's genius has yet conquered a special recognition for itself, and I too have come to fully admit it and appreciate it and him." If Whitman was the only major poet to attend the ceremony in the flesh, there was another who was there in the spirit. Or at least that was how he recalled it years later, which is just as significant, I believe, if not more so. I am referring to Stéphane Mallarmé and his exquisite sonnet, The Tomb of Edgar Poe. This poem was actually commissioned after the Baltimore ceremony for a memorial volume about Poe, edited by one Sarah Whitman, no relation to Waltz, but rather one of Poe's fiancées from the last months of his life, who worked diligently for many years to keep Poe's literary reputation alive. The Mallarmé poem, which Mrs. Whitman translated herself, turned out to be the sole foreign contribution to the volume. And I find it extremely interesting that that contributor should have been Mallarmé, unquestionably the most important French poet of the period, and the one poet from that time, along with Whitman, who continues to exert an influence on the poets of today. But this poem was not Mallarmé's only involvement with Poe. Beginning in 1862, when he was just 20 years old, Mallarmé had been translating Poe's poems into French, a project he would continue working on until 1888. It was in 1883 when The Tomb of Edgar Poe was first published in French, as part of an essay on Mallarmé by Verlaine, that Mallarmé scrambled his facts and wrote to Verlaine that the poem had been read aloud at the Baltimore ceremony in 1875. Mallarmé, the most scrupulous and honest of men, would not have made this mistake on purpose. It can only mean that he actually thought it had happened, which serves to underscore the depth of his unconscious attachment to Poe. Before Mallarmé, of course, there was Baudelaire, the master poet of the succeeding generation, and he, more than anyone else, was responsible for establishing Poe's enormous reputation in France, which continues until this day. His first, very long essay on Poe's life and work appeared as early as 1852, and as most of you probably know, he took on the considerable task of translating all of Poe's stories into French. Baudelaire's attraction for Poe was more than just literary admiration. Poe was an utterly heroic figure for him, the purest example of the modern writer, the writer as outcast, the genius at odds with the strictures of his own society. From Baudelaire's 1852 essay, quote, "The life of Edgar Poe was a lamentable tragedy. The various documents I have just read lead me to believe that for Poe, the United States was a large cage, a great bookkeeping establishment, and that he made grim efforts his entire life to escape the influence of this antagonistic atmosphere." Sentiments such as these led to a growing feeling in America that Poe was not really an American writer, but a French writer who wrote in English. Most of his famous stories, after all, had European settings, and his celebrated detective tales, The Murders in the Rue Morgue, The Purloined Letter, take place in Paris and have a French hero, Auguste Dupin. Poe somehow didn't fit into the schemes devised by literary historians about early American literature. He wasn't connected to a legendary New World past, as Washington Irving was, for example, the Dutch of New York, or to the colonial past, as Nathaniel Hawthorne was, the Puritans of New England. And above all, and underneath all, he just wasn't optimistic enough to suit American tastes. In 1925, however, a mere 50 years after the ceremony in Baltimore, William Carlos Williams, perhaps the most consciously American poet since Whitman, had this to say about Poe in his book, his very great book, In the American Grain. Quote, Poe was not a fault of nature, a find for French eyes, ripe but unaccountable, as through our woolly-headedness we've sought to designate him, but a genius intimately shaped by his locality and time. It's to save our faces that we've given him a crazy reputation, a writer from whose classic accuracies we've not known how else to escape. It is the New World, or to leave that for a better term, it is a new locality that is in Poe assertive. It is America, the first great burst through to expression of a reawakened genius of place. Poe gives the sense for the first time in America that literature is serious, not a matter of courtesy, but of truth. Williams goes on to talk about Poe's literary criticism at great length, the reviews and articles that the hardworking author wrote throughout his short life concerning recently published American books. Attack against the mediocrity he had found everywhere around him. His struggle to define what would be a distinctly American literature, independent of English and European models. In this sense, and perhaps in this sense alone, he resembles Whitman, an American writer seeking to ground himself in a purely American approach to writing. Thus, Poe must suffer by his originality, Williams goes on. Invent that which is new, even if it be made of pine from your own yard, and there's none to know what you have done. It is because there is no name. This is the cause of Poe's lack of recognition. He was American. He was the astounding, inconceivable growth of his locality. Gape at him they did, and he at them in amazement. Afterward, with mutual hatred, he in disgust, they in mistrust. It is only that which is under your nose which seems inexplicable. Here, Poe emerges, in no sense the bizarre, isolate writer, the curious literary figure. On the contrary, in him, American literature is anchored, in him alone, on solid ground. By now, we are in the 20th century, and it is interesting to note that Williams's three most distinguished contemporaries, Eliot, Pound, and Stevens, all turned to the French for their inspiration. At roughly the same time that Paul Mallarmé's disciple, was basing his theory of poetry on an interpretation of Poe's poetic principle, an essay that in all likelihood was written as a practical joke, Eliot, Pound, and Stevens were immersing themselves in the poetry of Baudelaire, Rimbaud, Mallarmé, Laforgue, and other late 19th century French poets. And at just the same time, we have another major French poet, Valéry Larbaud, treating Whitman as such a compelling influence that not only did he translate Leaves of Grass, but wound up striving to create poetry in French that directly corresponded to the expansive tone and linguistic flourishes to be found in Whitman's work. In other words, poets in each country were looking across the ocean for new ideas. Eliot, the kind of poetry I needed to teach me the use of my own voice did not exist in England at all and was only to be found in France. Pound, practically the whole development of the English verse art has been achieved by steals from the French. Stevens, French and English constitute a single language. When a poet looks to a poet from another country for inspiration, It means that he is looking for something not readily available to him in his own language or literature, that he wants to break free of the confines of his own culture, but always in the end to make it his own, to bring it back to his own place. Slavish imitation can produce nothing of any interest, but every original artist has always been alert to what cell phones are doing. But every original artist has always been alert to what other artists are doing. No one can work in a vacuum, since the important thing is to use what inspires you in another's work to your own purposes, which means that you must have a purpose in the first place. The Whitman-Larbeau connection is instructive. Larbeau wrote that he wanted to invent a poet himself who, quote, was sensitive to the diversity of races, peoples, and countries, who would find the exotic everywhere, witty and international, one, in a word, capable of writing like Whitman, but in a light vein. And it's applying that note of comic, joyous irresponsibility that is lacking in Whitman. Larbeau was looking to Whitman for inspiration, yes, but also rejecting those aspects of his work that did not seem relevant to him. And the result was something totally original, totally French, totally Larbeau himself. If the spunk and spirit of many of the best French poets of the early 20th century, Larbeau, Apollinaire, Saint-Saëns, can be seen as a transatlantic response to Whitman, it is equally true that these same poets had a lot to do with the spunk and spirit that developed in certain strains of American poetry in the 1950s, particularly in the work of the poets who comprise what is known as the New York School, John Ashbery and Frank O'Hara, both Francophiles, among them. I sometimes feel that the soul of Guillaume Apollinaire flew across the ocean after his death in 1918, and after 7 years of searching for someone whom to be reborn, finally chose to inhabit the mind and body of Frank O'Hara. The parallels between the two poets are remarkable, even uncanny, not just because of the exuberance to be found in their work, their oneness with the times they lived in, their urban sensibilities, the stylistic freedom of their poetic inventions, but also because both men lived among and wrote about painters, the radical painters of their day, Apollinaire the Cubist, O'Hara the abstract expressionist, and because both of them died so horribly, horribly young, Apollinaire at 38, O'Hara at 40, as if a soul such as this one simply burned too brightly, too intensely to be granted a long life on earth. Apollinaire was the first truly modern poet in France, the first poet to embrace the wonders and contradictions of the 20th century, to feel perfectly at home in a world of automobiles and airplanes and gigantic cities. 40 years later, after Zone, I was going to read from it, there's no time. 40 years after Zone, in a poem entitled A Step Away from Them, O'Hara describes a walk through Midtown Manhattan during his lunch hour, musing on the sights and sounds and people he encounters, beautifully evoking the jumble of New York streets and sidewalks, thinking about his recently dead friends, by turns joyful and wistful, utterly alive to what is around him. And then, quite unexpectedly, the poem ends with these lines: a glass of papaya juice and back to work. My heart is in my pocket. It is Poems by Pierre Reverdy. Reverdy, the much admired contemporary of Apollinaire, as if O'Hara were saying to us in that last line, Reverdy is with me. His work has helped me see all the things I am seeing, and without his example, I would not be able to discover where I am. All poets belong to a place, to a language, to a culture. But if the task of poetry is to see the world with fresh eyes, to re-examine and rediscover the things that everyone else passes by without noticing, then it stands to reason that the place of the poet will often seem unfamiliar to the rest of us. He's been looking at that brick wall, or that mountain, or that flower, and thinking about it more than we have. And so, when he tells us about it, there's a good chance he will surprise us. tell us things we haven't thought about until we heard his words. And therefore, his words might strike us as strange. We might have to listen a second time before we understand. It might take 100 times or 100 years before we can hear what he is saying. This brings us back to Poe, the luckless, misunderstood Edgar Allan Poe, the man who never managed to fit in, but an American just the same, and more deeply American than the poets who refused to come to the memorial ceremony in 1875, Longfellow and Whittier, whom Poe had rightly attacked years before as imitators and fakes. It took the French to rescue Poe from obscurity, but since then, we've been able to claim him back as our own. Poe and Whitman, two wildly different writers, but both quintessentially American. And it is significant, I think, that Whitman himself could finally recognize this toward the end of his life. What do I mean by American? I mean a writer who's directly engaged with the question of America itself. In the first half of the 19th century, that meant confronting the newness of the place, its enormous size, the materialistic insanity that drove its citizens, but also the idea of America, the utopian dream that this country was somehow destined to become a second Eden. Whitman, of course, embraces all this in his work, whereas Poe recoils from it, appalled by America's lack of tradition, its vulgarity, its eagerness always to give money the last word. Still, Poe's work could not have been written by anyone other than an American, just as Baudelaire and Mallarmé, two giants equally enamored of Poe, could not have come from anywhere but France. In France, the problems were precisely the opposite of those that prevailed in America. Too much tradition, too much past, too many monuments cluttering the present, with no wilderness left, no space in which to lose oneself, to reinvent oneself. Beginning with Baudelaire, the story of French poetry has been one of corrosiveness, of trying to eat away at those monuments and clear a new space to breathe in. I believe that was why Baudelaire was so taken with Poe, because he was at odds with his place. But it is also why Whitman appealed to so many later French poets, because he taught them the myth of the open air. Thank you.